Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richman, vice president of the foundation. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show on the internet that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day, the perspective that you well know is not going to be found on the major media talk shows and the major newspapers of the country. You get the libertarian perspective primarily on the internet and here at the Future of Freedom Foundation. Sheldon, drug war is back in the news, front pages. We've got Eric Holder coming up with this clever little plan to avoid mandatory minimum sentences. And then we had an event in Mexico that I'm familiar with from practicing law many years ago down in Texas. So why don't you start out talking about the what's going on with Attorney General Holder, and then I'll bring you up to date a little bit about the event that happened in Mexico regarding the drug war.
Sure. This is pretty fresh news. Holder announced today, Monday morning, that the administration, as part of a package of prison-related proposals that's going to be unfolded, but as part of that package, he wants to set it up so that people who are charged with selling drugs, but who I guess are selling relatively small quantities and who are not tied in with some bigger organization, will be charged in ways that they're not subject to these high mandatory minimum prison sentences. It sounds like I said, it's part of a prison package. So their concern, I guess, is with so many people in prison. We of course, the United States holds the record for percentage of population and absolute numbers. Its prison population, hands down, beats the rest of the world. I mean, even places like China, which doesn't sound very good. So I guess this is an attempt to address that and have fewer people going into the system. I'm not sure what impact it is. I mean, I haven't seen any estimates or figures on this, but of course, most arrests are at the state level, and this wouldn't affect that. But it just means that when the feds go after someone who is selling drugs, I don't think the feds go after people for mere possession very much. They do leave that to the states. So they're going to go after sellers, and they find someone who's not a big-time seller and who's not linked to some big organization or organized crime. They're not going to put them on a track toward these high mandatory minimum. I guess that's an incremental, very tiny progress. A few people won't get long prison terms who would have gotten otherwise, so we can say thank goodness for that. But it hardly begins to address this issue.
Yeah, I get the sense that he's essentially copying what the drug war critics have been saying for decades about, overcrowded prisons and ruined lives with these mandatory minimum sentences. And so he's showing compassion toward people that get railroaded into prison because of a minor drug offense. And so he's got this little clever plan where he's telling the U.S. attorneys, as I understand it, just don't mention the exact quantity. And as long as you don't do that, then the judge isn't going to be bound by this mandatory minimum law. And that obviously serves to help out people in terms of these low-level drug offenses. It doesn't stick them in jail for 20, 30 years. But I'm still a little uneasy about what he's doing. I mean, you've got this law that Congress has passed. It's obviously a horribly bad law. But when prosecutors and the attorney general can simply circumvent a law by using little clever trickery, then it seems to me that that's a lot of discretionary power in the executive's hands. Seems to me that the much better approach in a nation that prides itself on as being operating under the rule of law is to go to Congress and say this is a bad law. It needs to be repealed. Judges need the discretion to do what judges do. They decide the sentencing. And instead, to come out with this way to circumvent the law, I feel a little uneasy about it.
Well, I see your point. Of course, they don't want to do away with mandatory minimums for, people they would regard as higher level operators, kingpins. So they wouldn't want to do that. Now, I suppose they could take your advice and go in and get the threshold raised. I don't know what the threshold is, how much you have to be accused of selling before that kicks in. So they could, like I said, take your approach and ask Congress to raise the threshold. I see your point about discretion, but if they're going to use discretion, at least use it in a way that will let people get out of long prison terms rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it's clearly a benefit for the guys that they're going to benefit from this. But, really it's a testament to how ridiculous this whole drug war is. I mean, it's been going on for decades, and they've tried everything in the books they could try, including, the use of the military in Mexico. And these mandatory minimum sentences were a response to the people that said, we're just not cracking down hard enough. And you end up with this horrible, abusive system where people are spending 20, 30 years in jail for, marijuana possession or distribution or whatever. And this is really a response to, I think, the mandatory minimum horror. The case I'm talking about in Mexico occurred in 1985, where an undercover DEA agent, I was practicing law in Texas at the time, and I'd done a bit of criminal defense work, including drug cases. So I was well aware of this case. There was a drug agent named Kiki Camarena who got kidnapped in Mexico, doing undercover work in Mexico by a big drug gang. And he's tortured brutally for about a week. And they were keeping him alive just for the purpose of torturing him more, because Camarena was key to the destruction of about, $8 billion marijuana plant, something like that, marijuana field. And so they were furious, and then they ended up killing him. And of course, the U.S. officials just went ballistic, as you would expect them to do whenever a federal official is killed. And they mounted this huge legal strategy to capture these guys. They kidnapped a bunch of people they felt were involved in it. They brought him back to the United States for trial. But one of the main kingpins was a guy named Rafael Caro Quintero, and Mexico refused to extradite him, and they indicted him themselves, and he got a 40-year jail sentence. And recently he got recently he got released after 28 years in jail on a legal technicality. The Mexican court said he should have been tried in state court instead of federal court. And of course, U.S. officials are furious, and the Association of Retired Former Narcotics Agents, I didn't even know there was such a thing. They've issued a public declaration about how horrible this thing is. But it really goes to show you, it brought back memories. This is 1985. This is almost 30 years ago, of another drug kingpin that was busted amidst a bunch of fanfare. The same type of thing we see today when they bust big drug kingpins. And it reminds us that this drug war is going on and on and on, and they can bust these drug dealers. Camarena died for nothing. He's hailed as a hero here in the United States, but he died for nothing. His death is meaningless. So when you combine all these ruined lives and the overcrowded prisons and the deaths of DEA agents and the incarceration of drug lords, it really just leads to one conclusion, Sheldon, and that's drug legalization, because that would end all this stuff, all the drug lords out of business immediately. Isn't that what the DEA wants to do? It wants to drive these people out of business. That's the only way to do it, through drug legalization. They're out of business immediately. Well, of course, that puts the DEA out of business too.
Well, that's right. The fact that you can come up with these sort of conflicting flows of ideas shows that there's something not quite kosher about the whole thing. We can say it's a failure, but maybe by one standard, it's a rousing success, the war of drugs. A lot of people have a lot of power, prestige, and wealth as a result of it. I don't mean just the kingpins. Of course, the kingpins would not want legalization. But let's just talk about the people that are legal, the policymakers, the people that operate prisons, the people that operate drug rehab, and all the money that pours into police departments. A lot of people are doing very well because of the drug war, and it has nothing to do with the fact that it doesn't make drugs any less prevalent. It's easy to get drugs. They're affordable. And, if you know the right people, you can probably get any drug you want without going very too far from your home. So, I hate to use the old cliche of Einstein's definition of insanity about, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, but it fits here too well. How are we to explain that after all these years, they do the same thing, except they make it more intensified? It doesn't ever achieve what they say they want to achieve, and yet they never say, well, I guess this whole thing has been a big mistake. Maybe we need to rethink it and get rid of the whole thing. Why is that not happening? I mean, something is terribly wrong. I guess the best explanation is they're doing too well off it to even want to change it, and they wouldn't want it to end. They wouldn't want it to even succeed, because what would they do it the next day? Close up shop, and they'd have to say, no, we still need it because drugs might, come back. So, it's not what it appears. It is not what it appears, and we have to look below the surface to see what's really going on.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think there's a lot of people on the take, including prosecutors, including law enforcement officials. I mean, all these drugs are not being imported in here just because these people are so good at avoiding law enforcement. Part of what's going on here is payoffs and bribes. And there's law enforcement agents on the border that are doing very nicely because of that stream of income. But notwithstanding that, as you point out, a lot of these people are just dependent on the drug war. I mean, these drug agents, the ones that are now retired, that are out of there, that were fighting the drug war back in this era of Camarena, they're on fat pensions, and the young drug agents today that are mouthing the same mantras about how we got to fight drugs and all this that were being mouthed 30, 40 years ago, they're looking to get their fat pensions, and the thought that they might lose their jobs is scary because they got mortgages to pay. And so you have this whole industry, I totally agree with you, that's been built up that is dependent on the war on drugs. It's no different from alcohol prohibition, where you had the Al Capones and the Untouchables and all this, all fighting the Al Capones and stuff. But as soon as prohibition's over, you don't need the Al Capones anymore. I mean, the Elliot Ness, I meant to say instead of Al Capone. You don't need the Elliot Nesses anymore because you don't have the Al Capones anymore. That the repeal of the prohibition would get rid of the drug lords, the drug gangs, the drug cartels immediately. And therefore, what do you need the enforcement vehicle for?
Well, I think it's, if it was only ideology, if they only just were caught up in this idea that drugs are evil, we must stamp out drugs, it seems to me after all these decades, it would dawn on them that this is not doing it. And they would begin to rethink things. So it makes me think that there is economics and finances, at least bolstering the ideology. I mean, these things are complex. There's, I'm sure, not one explanation, but I would think just the power, prestige, and money have to be a strong factor in all this, because it's the kind of thing that would keep you from rethinking it and saying, yeah, this is really ridiculous. Like all this time, all this money, all this law enforcement, and you can get any drug you want by, going down the street. You'd think if it was only just this view that drugs are bad and we got to do something, you'd say, this isn't working, so let's take another look at this. But if it's money and stuff related to that, power, prestige, then I think you're going to be more resistant to the facts and say, well, who cares if we're not really getting rid of it? We still have this great edifice and we're maintaining it, and we're living well off it. And I can't come up with a better explanation because, like I said, you go decades and decades with putting people in jail, making the inner cities hellacious, ruining lives, and you're still not really, and drugs are still plentiful and affordable, and you're not willing to rethink it. Something's up. Something's going on there.
Yeah, we here at the Future of Freedom Foundation have long opposed these incremental steps to get rid of this thing. I mean, medical marijuana is one of those examples. I mean, obviously, medical marijuana is an improvement on the current system, but it's not something that we've ever fought for here at FFF, because it's essentially saying that the government should control what people ingest and shouldn't ingest. And we've always taken the position that the essence of a free society is to have the right to ingest whatever you want without being punished by the government. And I know there's been some news on the medical marijuana front. Why don't you relay that to our viewers as well?
Well, over at CNN, their chief medical guy, Sanjay Gupta, had long been on record being, he against even medical marijuana. He had declared some time ago that, there was no promising medical use for marijuana. But I guess in preparing a new special, which I don't think has aired yet, but coming up maybe. He took a fresh look at it, and then last week announced that he was wrong, that he had rushed to judgment, he hadn't been careful in researching this, and he apologized and said, in fact, there were medical applications. He also heard him say the other day that he can't find one documented case of an overdose from marijuana. However, he's still against recreational marijuana, so he's not for freedom. And so he's only gone as far as medical marijuana. My take on medical marijuana really comes from the late Dr. Thomas Szasz, who I think made a good point about this. Szasz pointed out that medical marijuana it certainly may let sick people get the marijuana who might otherwise have a tough time doing it. So in that sense, it's good. But in the larger social political sense, it's not a blow for freedom, as you suggested, because what it does is it's the government saying, look, we can control drugs that we believe are dangerous. We can prohibit drugs that we believe are dangerous. But if you can convince us that a particular drug can treat certain ailments, then we will if we can certify that, then we'll allow people with those ailments and only those ailments to get marijuana, through a doctor's supervision to address those particular sicknesses. I don't see that as a blow for freedom. Now, it may be, and apparently in California it's kind of like this, that it's the medical marijuana regime is a bit loose, and people can get marijuana who, really aren't sick. I've heard stories about this. It's a good thing that they're not enforcing the law like they could, but could easily go the other way too, where they really crack down on recreational use because they want to make it very clear that this is only for people who are, who have an officially proclaimed disease by the state. I don't regard that as an advancement for freedom. I much prefer what they did in Colorado and Washington State, where they just deregulated.
Yeah, you have to ask yourself, what is this all about? One part of it is it's an improvement in the lives of people that are sick that can benefit from marijuana and whose doctor is there endorsing that as a prescription. But really, what we're really aiming for, especially here at FFF and the Libertarian movement, is a free society. Why do adults have to go to the government and say, may I take this drug for medical purposes or any purposes whatsoever? Why should you have to explain that to a government official? And that's why we keep trying to raise people's vision to that higher level. Before we leave this subject, while you were talking, I was reminded of that famous letter that Milton Friedman wrote to Bill Bennett, probably like 40 years ago. And for anybody viewing this, I highly recommend you Google Bill Bennett's open letter to Bill Bennett about the drug war, because everything we've said about the drug war plus more is in that letter that Milton Friedman wrote, that this thing's a horrible thing. It's going to result in death and destruction and ruination of lives. And that was some 40 years ago. And you can see Bill Bennett's response, too. This exchange was in the Wall Street Journal, and to read it 40 years later, it's a real eye-opener. Hey, let's move to... Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I was going to say, I think Bennett called Friedman stupid and wondered what he was smoking. It was that level of a response.
Yeah, and now when you look at the exchange in retrospect, everything Friedman was saying has come true. You're just going to end up with this horrible, horrible mess. And now you've effectively gotten Holder to implicitly acknowledge that they've ruined people's lives, that they've got these overcrowded prisons, that people don't belong there. I think that's a significant admission. Let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. Not surprisingly, that thing's a huge mess, just like the drug war. You've got these drone assassinations that are taking place in Yemen. You've got the Fort Hood bombing case. You've got Syria that's just an absolute mess, and the U.S. is saying that Al-Qaeda is now coming back. When will people finally realize, Sheldon, the interconnectedness of all this? Then you've got the NSA, of course, over here with all the big scandal of spying on us so that they can protect us from all of this blowback that they're producing in places like Yemen and Syria and so forth. When will people see that the national security state is really not a good thing for us?
Well, it's not even coherent because the Obama administration is on al-Qaeda's side, was in Libya and is in Syria, and yet it's helping others fight al-Qaeda types in Iraq and other places, Somalia, and so it's not coherent. I mean, you can't pick your spots and on one side help those groups, and then in other places fight those groups, and it is kind of one big thing. I mean, people flow across the Iraq-Syria border, like it's no big deal. So fighters will maybe one day fight in Iraq and then go over in Syria. So one day they're on the U.S. side and the one day they're against the U.S. side. Just depends on what side of the border they're on. Something is really screwy there. Iraq is a mess. There's been all kinds of sectarian killings of Sunni and al-Qaeda types against Shiites. And, Afghanistan is not doing terribly well. It's just getting, the whole thing is in disarray, and it just shows you what's wrong with this whole approach, the national security state. Again, I don't want to say they don't know what they're doing, because I think the people who operate the policy and the military-industrial complex are doing quite well and probably wouldn't change a whole lot. The contracts are flowing and lots of money is being spent, but if you judge it by what's happening in that region, it looks like a big a fiasco, quagmire.
Yeah, I was reading accounts of this major Nidal Hassan case, the Fort Hood killing, and it's a horror story. I mean, where guy's just shooting these unarmed personnel there at Fort Hood, and they're now testifying and telling what happened, and I just grimaced as I'm reading this thing. But and this guy is defending himself, but they're saying that he's pretty much trying to do everything he can to get a death sentence. But underlying this, and I don't know whether this guy is going to testify or not, but underlying all this is the motive issue. And we can't ignore that the man was motivated by what was going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that's significant because, as we've argued ever since 9/11 and even before 9/11, is that what the American people need to do is to make a very serious examination of U.S. foreign policy and the results that it produces. So you've got all these drone assassinations in Yemen, and Ron Paul's got a good op-ed about that today, where they're just killing untold numbers of people there. Now they say, oh, well, we're just targeting militants. Well, what's a militant? And in the process of targeting these so-called militants, they're killing women and children, old people. And that produces that anger. And how can it not produce the anger and hatred when you've lost your child in one of these drone assassinations? And then when the blowback happens and people do these horrific things like 9/11 or whatever, the government says, oh, no, it has nothing to do with what we're doing overseas. And that's the big debate that we've been having since 9/11. I think we've pretty much won this debate that, the Bush people and later the Obama people were saying, oh, no, this is because they hate us for our freedom and values. So here you have this disaster story in Iraq where there's daily killings going on every day. And I think what's ominous is that U.S. officials really consider Iraq to be a free society now. That was like a Iraqi enduring freedom or one of those nonsensical labels they have there. You've got the mess in Afghanistan where they're still supporting this crooked, corrupt, unelected regime in Afghanistan. And that's producing, this al-Qaeda resurgence. You got, as you point out, we're supporting al-Qaeda in Syria. And so you've got this entire mess that the NSA then says, well, we have to spy on you to protect you, to keep you safe from all these threats that the Pentagon and the CIA are producing. And that's why, we keep emphasizing that this isn't just a problem of getting out of Yemen or getting out of Afghanistan. Americans need to be debating this whole Cold War construct. Because notice that while the U.S. is shutting down all its embassies around the world, Switzerland's not shutting down any embassies. Why? Because they're not out there doing the drone assassinations. They're not out there invading countries and occupying countries and assassinating people. So they don't have this threat of blowback, and they don't have this big NSA spying on everybody like the U.S. does.
Yeah, it talks about the Fort Hood matter. That, of course, is a military installation, and it's a fort. And all those guys were unarmed, and I guess women were unarmed. And I believe that was a policy put in the 1990s. These are soldiers, and yet they weren't allowed to wear sidearms. And I venture to think that many fewer would have been shot if they had been armed. But they had been disarmed at one point. The other thing about some people have criticized the Fox types, Hannity likes to criticize Obama for not declaring that the shootings were an act of terrorism at Fort Hood. But strictly speaking, it's a military installation, and he was trying to keep soldiers from being sent over to Afghanistan. And I don't know that qualifies as terrorism. I'm not saying it's justifiable, but it's a military installation. Terrorism, I believe, is largely about attacking civilians in order to, strike terror in them and then affect some change in their government policy. But this was a military installation, so I think we should at least be careful about our definitions. I agree with what you say, sure, about the whole national security state. We kind of asked for this trouble. By that I don't mean the policymakers invited it or welcomed it, but the point is their policies provoke it. You can't drop bombs on people and support dictatorships and not expect to be people mad at you and maybe try to get revenge for it. So this is what happened. People still act like 9/11 was some kind of out of the blue event, and history began on 9/11. One day, some people just decided to attack, fly planes into buildings. For no reason at all, while the United States was minding its own business. Of course, that version of history is just ridiculous. Nobody wants to keep in mind what the U.S. has routinely done in the Middle East, not to mention other places, for many, many decades, going back to, at least the 50s. And so you're right. We have to sort of get off this treadmill. And then any remaining terrorism threat, I think, will be shrunk to very small levels, manageable levels, and it would be very hard then for the government to even try to justify something like the NSA spying, which now Obama has unveiled some window dressing to try to make it look like it's going to be more sensitive to civil liberties. I wouldn't expect a whole lot from that. But we should remember one thing, that we wouldn't have even gotten the window dressing had it not been for Snowden. So people that want to declare Snowden a traitor ought to keep that in mind. We wouldn't even be getting these this wouldn't even be addressed by Obama publicly had it not been for this leak of information.
Yeah, your point about the gun control there at Fort Hood is fantastic. I mean, there's that gun control angle. It was a gun-free zone. And so, as we've always argued, that's the place where mass murderers choose to go. They're not going to go into a gun show and start shooting it up. They're going to find the areas where people are prohibited by law from defending themselves with weapons. And one of these was Fort Hood or any other military installation. And man, I mean, this guy was able to just kill everyone there to his heart's content until, the police show up. But by that time, he'd already wreaked so much damage. And so another classic example is when you disarm peaceful, law-abiding people from defending themselves, that's the place where the mass murderer goes. And I find that on the Obama and Snowden and the NSA spying, I find it amusing where Obama says, well, if this young man really believes in what he's doing, he ought to come back to the United States and defend his principles. And you mean like Bradley Manning, who's going to be facing a life sentence? I mean, they criticize Snowden for ending up in Russia, but it was their deprivation of his passport that stuck him in Russia. I mean, he was ready to move on to Venezuela or somewhere else in Latin America, and they revoked the passport, and that's where he ends up. And, I'm sure the guy would love to be back in the United States, living a normal life, but when you've got the choice between living the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary, most likely in solitary confinement, never talking to anyone, living in a little cage year after year after year, traveling around Russia, even though it is an authoritarian regime, seems to me much more attractive than sitting in a federal cage. And let's face it, that federal officials, including Obama, are in a quandary because they know that Americans are outraged over this spying, this secret surveillance, and the only way they got to learn about this was not because Obama said, I want to be honest and tell you what we're doing here. It was because Edward Snowden said, I have a crisis of conscience. I can't participate in this, and I need to let you guys know what's going on.
Yeah. And so, of course, since then, we've learned that it's even, because of his leaks, the power to spy is even broader than we originally thought. And contrary to what the Obama administration was telling the American people. So they've systematically lied. We know that Clapper, the director of national intelligence, lied to the Congress under oath. But Obama has lied consistently to the American people, saying we're not spying on Americans. And so why should we believe anything that they tell us? And when they tell us they're now going to be more sensitive to civil liberties and bring in some kind of civil liberties advocate to have this person there as part of the FISA procedures, I think we should just laugh at that. Why should we believe them at all?
Oh, you can't, because their own policy is to lie if it's in the interest of national security. So once you have that policy that you're going to lie, there's no way that you can ever trust these people. But anyway, that's the show, Sheldon. We've got to wrap things up now. This is Sheldon Richman and Jacob Hornberger for the Future of Freedom Foundation. If you're watching this video and you're not familiar with FFF, come and visit our website at fff.org or our Facebook page, and we're on Twitter. And we have a great monthly journal called The Future of Freedom that Sheldon edits. We've got a daily email publication called the FFF Daily, which brings you the best libertarian-oriented articles on the internet every day. Love to have you join us, and we need your support. So thanks so much for tuning in, and this is the Libertarian Angle.